Oh, neat. A whole civilization did not die last night. That is right. After 39 days of fighting, Donald Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire in the Iran war. However, the ceasefire between the United States and Iran is not a promising start for negotiations. Maybe fire will be ceased, but the countries' joint interpretation of the ceasefire is contradictory, and we should not walk away from this thinking that everything is done. So, today, let's look at the fundamental problem facing the so-called ceasefire. Then we can look at a couple of reasons for optimisms why fires will nonetheless be ceased, one involving Trump learning about the realities on the battlefield, and another about the underlying chances of protesters re-emerging. But let's start with the ceasefire itself. You might remember just a few days ago, the media was in a frenzy about Trump blowing up Iran's power plants and bridges come Tuesday, should Iran not open up the Strait of Hormuz. By Tuesday morning, it turned into a question of a whole civilization dying. There is something to be said about the media reaction to this, which included the notion that the mere threat would prevent any deal from transpiring. But I will hold off on that until at least tomorrow, beyond the not-so-subtle reminder that this still fell under the category of things Donald Trump said. Well, lo and behold, apparently it did not make a deal impossible. Indeed, this has all come to a stop, at least for now. Here is Trump's post from Truth Social announcing a pause to the war. The key parts are, quote, subject to the Islamic Republic of Iran agreeing to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Trump agrees to suspend the bombing and attack of Iran for a period of 2 weeks. 2 weeks? Where have I heard that before? Anyway, skipping about halfway down, the United States, quote, received a 10-point proposal from Iran and believes it is a workable basis on which to negotiate. Well, what is that 10-point proposal, you might ask? Good question. You'd think it would be easy enough for Iran to release the 10 bullet points, but no. Iranian state media has published a summary of the demands, which includes the lifting of all sanctions against Iran and the US military entirely withdrawing from the Middle East. The second one is not happening. The United States is not about to enfeeble itself in the region, especially in an era as chaotic as the present. It is also hard to imagine that Iran will get out from under the entire array of economic sanctions. But those are just touching on the real problems. The Farsi version of the summary includes that the United States would accept Iran's right to enrich uranium. This is how the saga began last June, and I do not think that the White House will agree to that. Tactically speaking, it is also hard to understand how Iran expects to construct new sites for enrichment purposes, given that its air defenses are a shell of what they were just 6 weeks ago. And no, shooting down one F-15 does not change that. Not when B-2 stealth bombers can handle that mission anyway. But the biggest problem is that Iran's 10 points include Iran's continued control over the Strait of Hormuz, the exact thing that the ceasefire was contingent on. This is an absolute non-starter for the United States. And even if something bizarre happens where Trump specifically accepts it, maybe because he wants to leave Europe with the problem, it is difficult to believe that it would carry over to any future US president. As it stands now, Iran is charging $2 million as a toll for any vessel transiting out of the strait. Few are taking Tehran up on the offer, but there are some. If that became the new normal after the war ends, and traffic returns to its regular frequency, Iran would secure about 65 of these fees per day. Over the course of a year, that comes out to $47 billion. By comparison, Iran's GDP is $375 billion. Now, that back-of-the-envelope calculation likely overestimates the fees that Iran would bring in. For example, one would imagine that tankers filled with Iranian oil would be exempted. Traffic would not fully return to normal either, as marginal tankers would find other places to conduct their business. Correspondingly, if $2 million is what Iran could charge in wartime, The maximally extractive toll would drop off considerably in peacetime. Regardless, though, it would be a massive windfall for Iran. Point is, something has to give on this. Despite much of the commentary on the subject, it is worth noting that the United States did not agree to Iran's 10 points. The Trump post just said that it was a workable basis to negotiate. The Iranian foreign minister's statement, posted a little while later, discusses the American 15-point plan and the Iranian 10-point plan as the joint foundation for negotiations, humorous given how contradictory they are. Fitting that theme, the foreign minister's message also says that, quote, for a period of 2 weeks, safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz will be possible via coordination with Iran's armed forces, with due consideration of technical limitations. This contradicts Trump's position of the, quote, complete, immediate, and safe opening of the strait. To make things more complicated, the Iranian Security Council, through state media, released a statement that says that the United States agreed to Iran's 10-point plan, in contradiction of the foreign minister's account, perhaps indicating that there is a fracture inside of Iran that may play out very publicly over the next few days. That has actually already started on Trump's end, as he disputes the authenticity of the Iranian Security Council's message, perhaps indicating that the United States is only recognizing part of the Iranian government as having the right to negotiate. And to make things yet more complicated, Iranian state media separately released another statement saying that Iran and Oman will jointly charge for passage through the strait during the ceasefire. Again, that is contrary to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the strait. Collectively, all of this ignores how the strait being open is not a function of whether either party says that it is open. It is a function of whether shipping companies believe that their vessels are safe as they transit the area, something that we will have to wait and see about. One final note about ceasefires. 2 weeks is hardly enough time to sort everything out. The average gap between a ceasefire starting and a final settlement being reached is about 10 months, and it is still 4 months even if you remove historical outliers. Thus, I view the 2 weeks more as a cooling-off period. It will either be renewed in 2 weeks, or a war will restart. It would be historically rare for a finalized deal to be put in place by then. Okay, that all seems like a negative interpretation of the ceasefire, so let's shift to a couple of points about why you could be optimistic that something may eventually stick. Remember, war is a product of bargaining failure. Fighting is expensive, and so that gives each side an incentive to negotiate a resolution commensurate with the expected outcome of war, but does not come at any cost to either side. Thus, if we want to explain why wars end, we first need to explain why the parties could not reach a bargained resolution. Then we have to explain what fighting did in the meantime to resolve the barrier to negotiations. Well, just yesterday, there was a long story from the New York Times about Trump's final decision to initiate the war. I want to stick to the high-level account of what happened and how it connects to the war's possible termination, though we will revisit the longer story at another time. On February 11th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited the White House and presented his argument for why the United States would benefit from starting a war against Iran. The basic point was that both regime change and the destruction of Iran's military capacity were feasible. Iran would be unable to close the Strait of Hormuz in response, and damage to U.S. allies in the region would be minimal. You might remember that Trump seemed eager to start striking in January, but allies in the region argued that he needed to wait so that more defenses could be put in place. Now he was getting the signal from regional partners to go. Trump had the U.S. intelligence community research those findings and deliver a report the next day. It consisted of 4 questions. On the possibility of assassinating the Ayatollah, yes, that would be straightforward. On crippling Iran's ability to project power and threaten its neighbors, yes, that would also be straightforward. On triggering a popular uprising inside of Iran, that was a possibility, but there was no way to guarantee it, and it should not be an outright objective of the war. on initiating a full-scale regime change. Again, that was a possibility, but it was unlikely, and it should not be an outright objective of the war. There were no misconceptions that Israel's assessment was accurate, at least on the cabinet side. CIA Director John Ratcliffe described it as farcical. In his role as the National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio described it as a synonym for male cow feces. Sorry, Marco, but this is a family show about war. Now, if you interpret the debate inside of the White House as how to make decisions under the uncertainty that remained, different actors would offer different opinions on the best strategy moving forward. Someone like Vice President J.D. Vance, who does not place much value on international outcomes, would say that the war is not worth the risk, and that was indeed his position. But someone like Trump, with more hawkish tendencies despite having run for president on a platform of neo-isolationism, might look at the same piece of intelligence and decide to fight. Whether the risk is worth the reward depends on how valuable you find the reward. Either way, what can resolve the war is clarification about what war would actually produce. Iran rejects the United States' initial demands, because the Islamic Republic's government believes that it can do better than what the best U.S. intelligence assessment suggests. So the parties fight for a while, and then they settle once the U.S. intelligence community updates its information and downgrades its expectations accordingly, in line with what the Iranian government was originally thinking. That is a reason to be optimistic about how a ceasefire could turn into a long-term settlement, and if not this one, then one shortly later down the line. Meanwhile, there is a second perspective that also creates a cause for optimism. Recall that the intelligence community believed that regime change was possible at the start of the war, even if it was not a likely outcome. I think that there is a temptation to dismiss this as the war's motivating factor based on that assessment, but that is not how these calculations work. The fact that popular protests were possible at all, say even a 25% chance or slightly lower, still has a significant impact on what the United States could expect to achieve in the war. And even if the actual chance was much lower than that, say 10%, it may only have been 10% because the Iranian government was having to exert so much effort to suppress the protest movements. That, in turn, weakened Iran to an attack from the United States. But the key problem is that the underlying chance of protesters overthrowing the government was fleeting, and so U.S. coercive power would decline over time. That overrides the attractiveness of negotiating a settlement to avoid the costs of war. What you can extract out of Iran later, when protests are off the table, may be worse than fighting now. Well, then what ends the war is the end of the possibility of an uprising. There have been various intelligence leaks over the last couple of weeks, indicating that this window has indeed closed. If Iran's coercive power will now remain static, then there is no longer the pressing need to fight, and we should get a settlement. Again, I do not know if it is this particular ceasefire that will be sustained in the long run, but if it is not this one, and the protesters' prospects have indeed plunged, it could be the next one after some of the details get hammered out. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? The ceasefire, as currently constructed, is a bit of a mess, full of contradictions from both parties, and the terms that they are temporarily supposed to be agreeing to are not even agreed upon. Still, we might be optimistic about the war's end, if what originally caused it was a U.S. overestimation of what the war would produce, and it has now learned otherwise. Similarly, if the White House started the war to take advantage of the Iranian government being distracted by protesters, and that protesting is no longer feasible, then there is no need to continue the war. I believe that this is day 40 in a row for me now in the books, and we may very well be getting to a moment where things will slow down enough that I can get back to some of the longer form content that I have been putting on hold. Peace gods be willing. Watch the archive of the War Arc in the meantime. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.